Thank you for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here and to show a little bit of the work that the OECD has been doing in this area. As some of you know, we are doing a lot of work in thematic work in terms of workforce, social protection, also the impact of COVID. But we also are doing technical assistance to some countries. So I'll try to share some of the findings here. In preparing for this session, I was asked to think about the structural challenges in long-term care. A lot of them have been referred by different speakers. And the idea here is to try to put them with concrete data. So one of the key challenges that a lot of countries in the OECD area are facing is how to improve the workforce in terms of both attracting but retaining them. And the key challenge here is the fact that poor working conditions are limiting both the attraction, but also mainly the retention. This is a sector that has been discussed that is highly feminized. We see that across the OECD, 90% of the care workers are women. But there's also a strong migrant component with 25% coming from other countries. But particularly what is really preventing the sector from thriving in terms of workforce are in part low pay. We looked at data comparing long-term care workers, nurses, and personal carers, and compared the hourly pay with the same occupation in the hospital sector. And we found that there was a large gap in terms of the hourly pay. And when we talked across countries and workers, low pay is one of the issues preventing that people stay and that after a while they don't move to the hospital sector. But we also found other working conditions that limit this, in particularly the high rate of part-time work with 45% working part-time. Also temporary work is an issue with 20% being in temporary contracts, and the shift work that is also very predominant and prevents work-life balance for some workers who want to move to other sectors or occupation. And the other aspect of this is the fact that there are also lots of physical risk factors and mental health risk factors that affect the workers. We see that more than 60% actually suffer from physical risk factors, such as back pain problems. But also there is an issue of aggression coming from carees who might have dementia. And there's the issue of the pressure and this sort of imbalance between what is expected from them and the autonomy that they're given and the support. And particularly in a number of countries, it's been found that this pressure has increased over time. And there is really a gap between the skills that people have at the start and again, what is being expected. So often there's this discussion that the job is simple and you just need to take care of basic needs. But in reality, people also have to manage conditions, coordinate, deal with families. So it is a highly demanding job. In addition, one of the other topics that's already been mentioned that came across quite strongly when we look at the report Who Cares was the issue of care coordination. 1/3 of countries actually mentioned that coordination among across workers was rating very high in their agenda. And we see that this is an issue that has been amplified during COVID. And as my colleague has also mentioned, many efforts have been made, but still there is an issue of coordination between long-term care and the hospital sector, but also with the primary care sector. And this affects many aspects in terms of management of chronic conditions, but also the fact that there are many preventable admissions to hospitals among older persons. And there are also gaps, as you can see, in the hospital discharge planning. So some of the findings are that there are delays in discharge, that older person have to wait while leaving the hospital, but they also don't have a clear care plan when they leave the hospital. And all of this makes that readmissions to hospitals are also more frequent, but also that their autonomy deteriorates. On the other hand, other studies have found that having much more integration really prevents this, but also even prevents that people go into nursing homes after being in the hospital. And what we're also seeing across countries is not only this issues of coordination between long-term care and the health sector, but the fact that different services towards older people, which are part of the long-term care, are actually provided by different parts via the health sector and via the social care. And there is then also an issue of lack of coordination across the service provision in terms of having different assessments, different eligibility rules, which can also create an issue of incentives, particularly because some of the services within the health sector are often free of charge. There is no copayment, while those of social care do have. So this is also another challenge that countries are facing. Another topic that has been also discussed by other speakers is the issue of financing. And so there's the issue of public financing, but also the issue of the out-of-pocket for families. And the OECD has done a lot of work in this area, estimating whether the cost for people, and we see that the cost without having any kind of benefit or social protection across OECD countries can be very high. If an individual were to pay for this cost just based on their income, depending on the level of needs and the care situation, whether it's at home or an institution, we are talking about representing 1 to sometimes even 6 times the median income of an older person, which creates a huge need for having affordable services. But we also see that even in OECD countries, where there's been a lot of development in the long-term care area and social protection does exist across all countries, there is still an issue of high out-of-pocket. And what we can see here is that in a number of countries, home care, the out-of-pocket cost for home care, even after receiving social protection in terms of services or cash benefits, is already beyond the median income of a person. We also see a situation where for institutional care in 2 countries, This is also representing the level of median income or above the median income of an older person. But there's a range of countries, in this case, like almost like 50% of the countries, where the out-of-pockets also represent more than 50% of the median income. And you can think that even in those cases, theoretically, a person can still pay out those out-of-pocket costs, but it can also create issues of poverty in affording the other needs in terms of housing and food. So clearly, there is an issue still of rethinking the financing and how to ensure that systems are generous enough while still being sustainable. Another topic that has come across as a real challenge is the issue of quality. And what we can see here is that even before COVID, we see that there were quite a lot of safety risk and insufficient infection control, that infection rates were very high across long-term care residents. We also see a high rate of polymedication in long-term care residents. And what we see across countries is that there is still a lot of issues across monitoring quality, whether it's in terms of having the right indicators that are still very often focused on measuring inputs, the staff versus measuring outputs and quality of life, and the difficulty associated with that, but also in really monitoring those indicators and having the right tools for inspection and enforcing quality. So in terms of reform avenues, I wanted to present some of the recent reforms that have occurred or are in plan across OECD countries, in trying to give you a flavor how they're trying to address some of the challenges that I outline here. So in terms of workforce, which I discussed first, and a number of countries have attempted recently to improve working conditions. And for instance, I'll mention the example of Germany, which in 2018 started the concerted action to try to increase the number of workers. Particularly, this was very much focused in terms of nurses. So increasing the number of trainee nurses, but also having a higher pay and trying to recruit from abroad through programs, but overall also reforming training to make nursing more attractive. And more recently, the new coalition government is already announcing, on top of what was done during the concerted action, what has been done during COVID, in terms of also trying to improve wages and recruitment. The new coalition government that is now being formed in Germany is also announcing a new plan with €1 billion investment to give bonus, and again, trying to improve the attractiveness and recruitment of workers. Countries are also trying to rethink training to make it more fit and address this sort of imbalance between the skills needed and what is there. And here we did provide some advice to Israel, who did not have a specific training for personal care workers, and who's in the process of designing one and implementing it. And they wanted to look at different countries and how they're doing, in particular looking at the levels and how to also design a sort of career path also for personal carers. Also, we see a number of countries given informal carers wider support. And here again, we were also involved with the government of Croatia in thinking about how to design a new benefit for informal carers who until now they do not have any kind of cash payment. As I mentioned before, the issue of coordination is very often discussed, and Slovenia has been planning for a long time this Long-Term Care Act and trying to enhance coordination across workers, and they have in mind to have this one-stop shop for where there would be a common assessment and multidisciplinary teams working across health and social care. Spain also recently announced in the 2050 plan this idea, also thinking from the challenges and the learning from the pandemic about how to make institutional care smaller and more people-friendly, but also expanding home and community care, particularly also this issue of collective housing for older person. A number of countries are also thinking and slowly trying to promote the use of innovation and technology. And here Japan is a particular pioneer in this because it was an early adopter. And here there are subsidies for the use of robots, for instance, and we understand that about 30% of nursing home cares are actually using robots, particularly for monitoring, but also for mobility purposes. Here, other countries are also reconsidering the allowance, as I mentioned before, for informal carers. But also for the high out-of-pocket. This is the case of Slovakia, who has increased the allowance that is accessible for informal carers in the recent years. France also recently thought about the redesigning funding options and created the 5th branch of Social Security in 2020. This is a slow process, but here the idea that was portrayed this year in 2021 is for the CNSA to manage this new 5th branch and to use the tax on Social Security to fund long-term care, but more concrete funding options still need to be designed. In terms of quality, the Netherlands in 2018-2019, when they designed their new plan for promoting aging in place, they also place a stronger emphasis on quality control with monitoring indicators of well-being among older persons at home. So these are some of the reforms that have happened recently. And we were also asked about what supports or the success of the reform process. And here, of course, there are many aspects that can contribute or hinder reform. And I will just mention a few that come to mind. One is this issue of the wide stakeholder consultations. For instance, before starting the whole process of reform in France, they engaged in a wide consultation with more than 400,000 people nationwide. And they also had expert groups thinking about the different streams of autonomy and long-term care to provide ideas that contribute and then to a broad report that then is being disaggregated into more specific reports on workforce, on financing, and then on action plans. Another one is this issue of governance and also adapting the system progressively. because going for wide change can also be more challenging. And here we're also helping Lithuania in the process of thinking about the new long-term care legislation and how to make the best of the services that are already being provided by different parts of the system, and provide them in a more unified way. Another part that has been discussed before is this issue of piloting. This has been used in a number of countries, and I'll mention the example of Slovenia, where they started with this integrated care pilots in 3 areas. And then they, before rolling out progressively to the rest of the country. And it's also quite important to setting indicators. And here, Chile, when they started their program on Chile Cuida, which is primarily targeted at informal carers, both in terms of providing training and support, but also home care. They also had very specific indicators and ways of evaluating what was the impact in terms of how often people were contacted, the services that were offered, and trying to look at and evaluate all of this before moving on to other regions. And finally, the learning from other countries. As I mentioned in the case of Israel, this has been very useful of trying to understand in depth what is the training program in different selected countries that could be adapted to Israel, and trying to bring this best practice as before designing your own program. So these are some of the thoughts I wanted to share with you, and then further information can be found in some of our reports in social protection, in workforce, and the more recent work on COVID and long-term care. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you all for this amazing overview of all these initiatives in so many parts of the world. And I think it was great to end with this reflection on what are the elements of success when it comes to transformative processes. And I'd be very interested to hear if perhaps we could go back. We have a few minutes left without putting anyone on the spot, on any thoughts you have, those of you in the panel, about what, how have your experiences of supporting processes of change in different parts of the world resonate to the factors that Anna was describing? And I see a hand from Peter, and we can't keep Peter back. So Peter, hi.
You can't keep me back. I'm like a force of nature. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, I just, one of the final points there being made about trying to get more evidence and evaluate systematically new programs like the one that was described in Chile Cuida. I think that's absolutely essential. And one of the things I was actually having a conversation with WHO about a few days ago was that they were talking about doing reviews from the top down of different national systems of long-term care. And I think what's much more helpful is actually to look at particular interventions and models, particularly of integrated long-term health and social care, which are being, piloted and tried out in different countries, and coming up with a relatively robust but not too cumbersome, but also an evaluation model which enables you to compare to some degree across different interventions and different settings. Because a lot of interesting stuff's being done, but we need to capture and be able to comparatively evaluate those effects.
Thank you, Peter. And that is indeed a challenge, and it is a particular challenge to evaluate these innovations and how and there was a bit of chat discussed as well on the chat about how do we scale up and how do we have successful scaling up of these pilots at local level that sometimes seem to work very well, but then we don't quite know how to extrapolate. So any other thoughts from the panel in the last few minutes? And I know, Stefania, you are now representing Satish because he had to leave, so also feel free to jump in. Stefania has two hats, one at the European Center in Vienna, the other at WHO Regional Office for Europe.
Yeah, maybe just to step in quickly on the piloting aspect, I take the point Caitlin was making, and I think there's definitely a right and the less right way to do this. But what we have been seeing in Europe over the last 20 years is that a lot of funding that has gone into supporting innovation, so European level funding, international funding, supporting local innovations on the ground, when not sustained and when not supported by a long-term strategy and by the active, really proactive involvement of regional and national stakeholders, odds of success have been very limited. So there are many great ideas out there that are not being taken sufficient advantage of. And maybe it's time that we try to match the resources we put in the generation of good idea with the resources we put in really helping these ideas to take root. So
that's a very good point, I'd say. And I see a hand from, I think it's Julian Morelli.
Yes, thank you, Adelina. I want to just focus on and have you think about, this group think about terminology. Words, there is an article written by Dr. Nathan Stahl in Canada a few years ago that talks about the word, the title of the article was Words Matter. And maybe they take on a different connotation in different countries, but here in Canada, and I would suggest North America, the term informal caregivers is a term that's not viewed favorably among caregivers in principle. By default, using the term informal would suggest that caregivers primarily, principally are, from my knowledge, are family, and then chosen caregivers, where a resident chooses someone outside of the family, traditional family. I would strongly suggest that this organizations look at reframing that word. I've been advocating on our end and others that the term essential family caregivers pretty much sums up the majority of caregivers outside of paid caregivers. In Canada alone, we're looking at figures in a small country of 38 million of right across the continuum of care of 65 billion annually. So I don't find that to be informal. I actually find that if you talk to caregivers, that some spend as many as 50 and 60 hours a week providing care. And actually, there's evidence that I would suggest, or that I would say suggest that there are better care outcomes, not only emotionally, but physically, medically, that term be reframed across the spectrum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julian. I think that's a really important point. And I do think that the terminology in this area, in fact, earlier in the morning, and I think that was probably too early for Canadian time, we were having a discussion about the very term of long-term care. And I do think that then maybe we might need to have an international summit on the terminology that we are using. And I noticed also some comments, so a reply. So Hugh Boom, if you'd like to quickly come in, and then we will move to the next session.
Thank you, Adelina. I was just going to leave, but no, yeah, thank you for that notion. And we found a lot of different terms and languages to describe this so-called informal caregivers, and that informal caregivers has been used for a while, but it's not also used consistently. And there are also different types of caregivers or informal, like Stefania is mentioning, there can be families or other relatives or friends. So we are trying to more accurately define this term. And in our next publication, we're gonna use the term carers to cover all these different aspects rather than using informal caregivers, although which is already widely used. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we're going to end this session here. I'd like to thank you all, not only for presenting today, but also for all these initiatives and all this effort that your institutions and yourselves personally are also putting into moving us forward in this very, very important area. So it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, everyone. And I think we'll keep talking.